Hey, good evening, Nate. How you doing?
Doing well, Jay. How you doing?
I'm doing awesome. I'm up here in Vancouver, British Columbia. Just wrapped up Web Summit, looking at the content up here and how it can inform our next report, and also establishing some partnerships for future activities with the events we're going to cover. So I'm not going to hit that now, but there's going to be some good news coming out of this trip.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear more about it. And today, get to do this podcast with you again, and we're going to deep dive the moon, which is a pretty awesome topic.
It sure is. It sure is. So I'd like to jump right into this topic and
Okay.
visit a really interesting book that we uncovered as we were starting the research for this report.
Yeah, this
In
one blew my
19,
mind.
it really caught me off guard too, because I was not aware of this book, and I am a science fiction guy. But in 1949, Robert Heinlein wrote, and in 1950, he published a book called The Man Who Sold the Moon. And the book is incredibly prescient about what we're seeing right now in terms of all of the competition and all the forces at play when we look at the space economy. And so I'd like to take a quick moment and define a term that I think we're going to use pretty consistently with this, and then visit how that book starts to map out to some of the stuff we're seeing now.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so the term I want to describe is the cislunar economy. And cislunar really means the Earth to the moon. Okay, so we've got anything that's happening terrestrial Earth. It includes Earth orbit. So all the satellites, space station, pretty much the traditional space stuff we're seeing right now. But then it takes us 238,000 miles out to the moon and includes the moon. And really our biggest conclusion with this is if we're not looking at thinking about and managing what the cislunar economy will become, then we run the risk of being latent. And when I say we, I mean any decision maker, industry or government who's got a stake in Earth orbit, and then all the way out to the moon.
Yeah, and the moon is becoming important for a couple different reasons, which we're going to deep dive, but it really becomes foundational as a launching point to go beyond the moon, right? The whole Artemis platform project by NASA, its stated mission is to provide, a foundation and a launch pad for potentially Mars and beyond moon exploration. And so that's just one entity within our government that is saying, hey, the moon is important for this purpose. But going back to the 1950 book, let's talk about that, because if you read that and you take away the dates, some of the stuff covered in that book could read like a news article from, Jeff Bezos's launch or Elon Musk's, launch. Like there's a lot of things where you're like, man, did this guy come to the future, see some stuff and then go back and write about it?
No kidding. In fact, I was going to make a pop cultural reference before we talk about the book. And that is, I just saw a sketch, and I'm assuming it was very recent, with Saturday Night Live, called Star Trek Egos in Space or something like that. And it's about billionaires in space. It's talking about Jeff Bezos, it's talking about Elon Musk, Richard Branson, and them operating in space, taking their egos and their resources, and billionaires being in the space economy. And that's really the premise of this book, is that there's a billionaire named Harriman who has this personal goal of he wants to be the first person on the moon. And so he basically finds a way to develop an investment scheme to get people behind him to help fund the technology development for the rocket to get to the moon, the technology around the colony that he wants to put on the moon. He comes up with some political and some economic pride points to try and rally people behind him. In one case, he talks about a fictional cola company that he articulates is going to use the moon for advertising, and that scares people into wanting to invest in his company so that he can be the first person on the moon and he can control it. In another case, he's talking about how communists are going to utilize it, and how you've got to rally around America and make sure that it remains under American control. So a lot of things come from this book that are very, very prescient. Probably the most interesting thing for me, Nate, and I'd like to get your thoughts about the book, what really caught my attention, though, is the timeline that Heinlein developed and published in the book. And he's got a file in there. He's got a picture that shows all these different points, like when ray guns become available and the types of propulsion for spacecraft. And he's not terribly far off on some of the stuff we're seeing now.
He's not. And I saw that timeline when you brought it to the group and we were thinking about how to incorporate this into the article. And it was pretty remarkable in that, he wasn't too far off from when the first launch to the moon was in this book to when it actually was, when Neil Armstrong, landed on that moon and, took that small step for mankind. And even more so with further developments. I think one of the things that was interesting in, when you were just talking, you said he wanted to put a colony on the moon. And, Elon Musk has famously said he wants to build a colony on Mars, which is, also in space, but the moon is a launch point for that. And in some cases, there's a lot of cases in this book where you're like, man, is this individual pulling from our current pop culture, from our current environment of, billionaires, striving to be the first entity to do X, Y, or Z in space, on the moon, on Mars. And, people might be asking, why would they do that? Other than the ego quest, right? The Saturday Night Live skit ego quest. Well, McKinsey, right? I think we mentioned this in our last podcast, but by 2035, the global space economy is forecasted to be $1.8 trillion. That is a huge number. And even a, small portion of that is also a huge number. And there's a lot of potential for growth and a lot of potential for control of that marketplace and that economy. And that's why you see governments and why you see private industry, making aggressive leaps and bounds to own that space.
Absolutely. In fact, I just saw a picture recently of Elon Musk wearing a T-shirt that said "Occupy Mars." Just further reinforcing his intent to have people on Mars as part of a private enterprise. And for me, that was the biggest takeaway from the Heinlein book, as that author futurecast from a 1950s lens to where we are in 2025 and where we will be in the next couple of years. And that future casting that I find so fascinating is the technology is one thing. It's neat to see a science fiction writer talk about risk communicators and blasters and stuff like that. But what really caught my attention was that there was certainly the element of the political competition or the international competition between the West and the East. And that was certain Cold War era, post-World War II. So clear communist and anti-communist tension at play there. And that's certainly at play now with the national interests in space and on the moon, competitive and potentially combative, depending on how some assets could be used in the Earth orbit space. And then the other part that caught my attention from this book that I think is very prescient is the fact that he talks about the economic competition from private industry. Yeah. And that it's a billionaire driving this. And no kidding, that's what we've got right now. We just had Amazon launch Kuiper, and that's going to be a competitor with Starlink. And ironically, in that Saturday Night Live sketch, they had a scene where there's this giant SpaceX spacecraft staring down this much smaller Amazon spacecraft. And in some respects, it was very representative of what Starlink has established to this point, and Amazon's seeking to enter that from the private industry perspective.
Yeah, it was a very good skit. We should put a link to it because it's worth a watch. Let's kind of define the cislunar space or the lunar space, just the different players that we know of, off the top of our head that are currently occupying or plan to occupy or participating, on the moon currently, right? So we have Artemis with NASA. They have said that, they plan to visit the moon in order to visit Mars and beyond, right? We have Nokia Bell, right? Touchdown near the unexplored region of the lunar South Pole. And, they're planning on sending another batch to the surface and doing testing 4G cellular service on the moon, right? So you can communicate to other entities across, the lunar space through 4G technology. You have Lone Star Data Holdings, which we previewed at the Red Thread House at South by Southwest, who was able to establish a data center on the moon and push data from the moon to the Earth successfully, which is pretty awesome. We have China, who's occupied and established a presence on the dark side of the moon, so the far side. The moon does not rotate. The same face is, towards the Earth as it does its orbit. And so there's some conjecture about what they're doing, but if you want to pull the thread a little bit, there's lots of leaps and bounds in the quantum computing world, right? And implications for that. To run a quantum computer, you have to have really, really, really cold temperatures, like almost absolute zero. And a key element to that, if you're going to operationalize it, is helium-3, which is a very rare substance on Earth, but it's abundant on the moon. And there's thoughts that maybe, hey, they're looking at how they can harvest this and bring it back in order to enable their quantum computing effort, which has awesome impacts on a couple different fronts. Can you think of anyone else playing in the moon space, Jay?
So I was just thinking through the countries, and so you've got Russia, U.S., China, Japan, and India are the five national players who've had some sort of lunar module land. Of course, U.S. is the only one with people on the moon at this point in time, and the return to go to the moon. But yeah, I mean, it's a really crowded, forgive the word choice, but it's a really crowded space. Certainly in Earth orbit, but as we start to stretch it out, and just a quick reminder of the physics, 238,000 miles from Earth to the moon. In a radio wave, it's about 3-second latency. So it's really a pretty short distance from a relative perspective, both for data and communications transmissions, as well as for transit to get there.
Yeah, you mentioned Japan, China, and Russia. China and Russia announced recently that they're, exploring a partnership to have a nuclear powered research center on the moon, which I think is pretty exciting. I'd like to see how that comes to fruition and what that means for prolonged occupation. And, there's all kinds of studies and experiments you can do in a 0G or near 0G environment that you can't do on Earth, or you can't replicate it at scale on Earth. Japan recently announced, I think May 8th, an iSpace and KDDI study for cislunar communication, but it's part of a 1 trillion yen fund to support tech development by the private sector startups for expanding the space market, right? And so you have Japan and private industry in Japan looking at how they can partner for a more aggressive innovation in the lunar and the space economy.
So that raises a pretty interesting tension point then, Nate, because there's only 2 legal treaties or agreements that govern human activity in space and on the moon. And the most recent one's from 1979. And it generally says, and I'm just going to read this directly, that lunar resources are not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. And that, in essence, we're trying to keep the moon from being a source of international conflict. But what we're seeing is a couple of different tensions start to arise. First of all, that talks about nations. It doesn't talk about private companies. And we've seen several U.S. companies effectively land modules on the moon. Yeah. Right before South by Southwest, we saw Firefly land their module, and we saw Lone Star Data Holdings. While the module tipped, their payload was still able to function and meet all of their payload test requirements. And so right off the bat, that treaty is already too narrow because it's only national stakeholders or international players, doesn't include the private industry, but it also doesn't really account for the fact that in 1979, you didn't have things like cyber and electromagnetic activity on the moon that could potentially be an interplay point or a friction point between stakeholders. And you and I have talked about this. It's really fascinating to think through what would happen if a national stakeholder wants to tap into data that a private company has placed on the moon on a data store because of the benefits of being on the light side of the moon, the temperature and everything else, and basically create some sort of cyber activity between a nation and a company, or 2 companies or 2 nations, especially when the last governing document really says we're trying to make this not a place of conflict, but it starts to become a source of conflict in ways we haven't even imagined.
Yeah, it's safe to say in 1979, when they were writing, the treaties for space, that they did not envision private industry, not only having the potential to go to space, but if you look at where our space economy is currently, like, we're able to return to the moon and to space as much as we do because of private industry, right? Because of SpaceX, because of these reusable rocket launches that we really didn't have they weren't even in the conversation 10, 15 years ago. And now they're the commonplace practice for how we launch things into orbit. And so these laws are, outdated, and they're not even close to where we need them to be. This is very much the Wild West, or if you equate space to, the open sea in the 1500s, it's, I can envision an environment or a situation where, whoever has the largest fleet makes the rules, in East India trading company kind of thing, where, private organizations acting on behalf or in their own interest and the influence of a government are kind of setting the rules and the laws or the norms for how this economy is going to shape out. That has big implications too.
It certainly does, especially because the way that treaty is written, I don't think it accounts for what's going to be another major friction point around the Cislunar economy, and that is the competition for resources and extraction. With the
Yeah.
chemicals and minerals that are going to be available, the manufacturing capability, we could very easily see things being better manufactured in space or on the moon with low or no gravity versus manufacturing them on Earth, because you can put more design parameters into it. You don't necessarily have to account for certain stressors. And clearly that treaty did not consider autonomy, robotic systems, or any of the other activities we would see emerge.
No, it didn't. And there's man, there's so many common threads here that interweave with the report that we pushed out, right? Robotics, embodied AI, biotechnology. We did a portion of the article. We talked about, Ben Lamb, and we keep probably referencing him in every podcast we do because I think it's awesome what he and Colossal are doing. But, they're taking DNA and they're, de-extincting a mammoth or the dire wolves. And then what if you take that further and you look at what we can do with plants? And can we use technology and DNA from organisms, from plants, and can we create a resilience plants or, type of foliage that is able to help us terraform the moon and make it habitable for humans instead of, needing a suit in 10, 15 years. You have a plant that's able to create an atmosphere that allows us to walk and occupy. That's pretty awesome.
So great point, Nate. In fact, one of the interesting considerations is clearly not something that was in mind in 1979, because we probably weren't forecasting or envisioning the technology, although the ideas were certainly present in Robert Heinlein's book. So perhaps, the thinking was generally there in the science fiction space, but hadn't really entered mainstream. And I can understand that too. I mean, 1979, we were fresh on the heels of Star Wars. And so the notion of Star Wars becoming a reality over time and potentially people living on the moon as a jump off point to get to Mars. Two ideas really come to mind to me, though. First is the heavy reliance on autonomy, robotics, and AI. You hit that point perfectly. We're not going to be able to have people living on the moon full time without a lot of resources being applied, because you're certainly not going to grow food there right now. Could in the future. Don't have a water source, don't have air. So we're going to have to manufacture some of the necessities of life or transport them there in order to keep people alive on the surface of the moon. And then the other piece that really comes to mind is how quickly are we going to progress beyond the moon? So you and I are talking the moon right now, and what it's going to look like to access the moon, the level of autonomy versus the level of human engagement. So we may have completely autonomous systems or autonomous colonies, robots leading robots with AI, embodied AI, and referencing across an agentic AI approach to keep these semi or fully autonomous colonies going. One thing that emerged just this week, learned about a company called Astroforge. And Astroforge was up here at Web Summit. Short discussion, but they introduced their business model and they made a really interesting claim. Their business model is they are mining asteroids for high value minerals and metals.
That's crazy.
It is. And their CEO and founder was on the panel, and I have not researched this, so I'm going to state what he stated, and that is that he believes that they are the first commercial company to go beyond the moon with a space payload, as they sought to land on an asteroid to start demonstrating their extraction technologies and capabilities.
It made me think of the movie Avatar and the planet Pandora, and the humans occupy that planet to mine its natural resources because they're worth, billions or trillions, whatever, imaginary number they put out there, but it's incredibly valuable. Art imitates life. And I know that there's been, stories and fabrications and fictions about, occupying an asteroid or a meteor and, mining its resources, but it's crazy if they've actually done that or started to do that or demonstrated the capability to do so.
Yeah, there's a company pursuing that. So not only do we have this national and economic competition between private industry and nations, in Earth orbit and now on the moon, or certainly in the reach to the moon. We've got clear aspirations by nations and private industry to operate and reach beyond the moon, whether it's Elon Musk and occupy Mars, whether it's Astroforge and going and finding asteroids that have high value minerals and high value metals that they can extract and then return to Earth, or potentially return to the moon, where the moon could very well be an autonomous manufacturing facility or extraction facility. So the number of variables that are at play right now in the cislunar economy and how quickly it'll grow really require a lot of attention.
Yeah, we covered a lot of stuff just now. I think we need to do a quick recap, right? So, there's the cyber warfare, the cyber capabilities or the potential of the moon, right? Data storage, digital sovereignty, moving individual items of data back and forth, a potentially fully autonomous economy with, robotics that are enabling the growth, the development, the construction of facilities on the moon. Supply chain, as someone who spent, time in the Army as a logistician, that's always interesting to me. But, the supply chain for how things get to the moon and then what constructs it, what employs it, what, develops that footprint is pretty interesting to me. And then there's, the great land grab that will happen with both private and, sovereign entities to establish, the resources, the footholds, and what comes out of that is crazy.
It is absolutely crazy. My personal takeaway is I'm just looking at this from the lens of competition. We're going to have competition between countries and companies, and not just country on country or company on company, but it could very well cross over and blur between those, the country and some level of competition between a company and vice versa. And it's clearly extended beyond just Earth orbit to the moon, and it's going to very, very quickly go beyond the moon in terms of its reach, in terms of the economy, but also the competition that will occur in that economy as well. And so more than anything, I think the principal message is it is time to pay attention to the moon and the economy that extends from the Earth to the moon and beyond, because it will move fast, and there's an opportunity to be a first mover or an opportunity to be behind nations and companies in this effort.
Yeah, it's foundational. It's going to be foundational in the future. And I think you'll see more and more news come out here talking about efforts of what people are doing to get to the moon, to harness its resources, and to test new capabilities that include the moon or the cislunar space between the Earth and the moon. I'm excited to read about it and interested to see how it develops.
Absolutely. So, Nate, another great discussion. Appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, and I look forward to talking next time. I think we're going to discuss embodied AI and return to the mirror world, which that one's a pretty awesome topic too. I'm excited about it.
Yeah, that one's going to be pretty edgy. So if you got any questions out there, take a look at the report. The full report is now available at www.theredthreadx.com. If you are interested in learning more, grab that and reach out to us. We'd love to have a conversation with you. And thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, leave a comment also if you want us to answer any questions, and give us a like and follow. And we'll see you next week.